The dawn before humanity, 7 million years ago. The Earth looked nothing like the world we know today. No cities, no civilization, no humans. Only endless forests stretching across Africa, rivers carving their way through wild lands, and strange creatures walking upright for the very first time. This was the dawn, before humanity. Back then, the planet was entering a new age, a time of change. The continents had settled close to where they are now, but the climate was unstable, swinging between lush, tropical warmth and long, dry seasons. Deep in the heart of Africa, something extraordinary was taking shape, not in cities or temples, but within the living creatures themselves. This was the moment evolution began to draw a thin, fragile line between ape and human. In the forests of what we now call Chad, scientists would one day uncover the fossilized skull of a creature that lived around 7 million years ago. They named it Sahelanthropus chadensis, and for many, it marks the very first known step in the human story. Its skull was small, its brain no larger than a chimpanzee's, yet something about it was different. The position of the skull's opening, where the spine connects, suggested that this being walked upright. For the first time in Earth's history, an ape-like creature stood on two legs and looked out across the plains. That single evolutionary leap, the ability to walk on two legs, changed everything. It freed the hands for new purposes, to carry food, to defend, to touch, to create. And though Sahelanthropus could never have imagined it, this adaptation would one day lead to art, language, and technology, the essence of what we call human. But life, 7 million years ago, was brutal. Predators ruled the night, and survival was a constant struggle. The ancient forests echoed with the calls of early primates, the rustle of giant snakes, and the distant roars of saber-toothed ancestors. The early human's journey was not of conquest, it was of endurance. Every generation faced extinction, and yet something deep within them refused to fade. In these ancient lands, evolution was not a miracle. It was a war between species, a war for survival. And through that silent conflict, nature sculpted the first beings that would one day become us. Archaeologists believe that around this period, the African Rift Valley, a massive tear in the Earth's crust, began to shape the destiny of our ancestors. As the land split and mountains rose, climates shifted. Thick rainforests thinned into open grasslands. Creatures that once hid among the trees were forced into the open, and in that vast, unforgiving landscape, the first signs of humanity's resilience emerged. Walking upright was not simply a new posture, it was survival strategy. Under the blazing sun, standing tall reduced the exposure to heat and allowed early ancestors to spot predators from afar. The open hands could carry tools, stones, and food. These small, almost invisible adaptations were the foundation of the human revolution, a revolution that would take millions of years to unfold. Yet, there remains a question, one that still haunts scientists today. Why did humanity begin here, in Africa, and not somewhere else? Why did evolution choose this land, harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, as the cradle of mankind? Perhaps the answer lies not in the soil, but in the struggle. Africa, 7 million years ago, was not a paradise. It was a battlefield between life and death. And in that endless fight, only the most adaptable survived. The ones who could think, observe, and change. They were the ones who carried the spark forward. Imagine a mother Sahelanthropus, clutching her young as thunder rumbles across the plains. She looks to the horizon, unaware that her species is the beginning of something greater. unaware that her footsteps are the first marks on the road to humanity. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat, a quiet prelude to the story of mankind. As centuries turned to millennia, evolution continued its silent work. New species began to appear, each one closer to what we would one day recognize as human. But that transformation was slow, almost invisible. To nature, a million years is nothing. Yet in that time, bones reshaped, brains expanded, and hands grew stronger, more precise. The age of Sahelanthropus would give way to others, like Orrerin, Tuganensis, and Ardipithecus, early forms of humanity still clinging to both the trees and the ground, still uncertain of what they were becoming. But make no mistake, it all began here. This was the first step, the untold beginning of humanity. The line that separates man from ape was drawn not in cities or civilizations, but in the dirt of prehistoric Africa 7 million years ago. And while Sahelanthropus never knew fire, language, or art, it carried within its DNA the spark that would ignite the human journey. Every ancestor that followed, from Australopithecus to Homo erectus, would carry that torch forward. So the next time you look into the mirror, remember this. Behind your reflection lies a history older than imagination. A history written in bones, blood, and time. The story of who we are did not begin with kings or empires. It began with a single creature standing alone in the African wilderness. 7 million years ago, the rise of the early ancestors. 7 million years ago marked the first step in humanity's story. But the next chapters were even more extraordinary. As the millennia passed, nature continued to experiment, shaping and reshaping the creatures that would one day become human. The Earth was restless, and so was evolution. Roughly 6 million years ago, a new species appeared in the dense woodlands of East Africa, Orrerin tugenensis. It was small, standing barely over 4 feet tall, with arms still adapted for climbing trees and legs strong enough to walk upright on the ground. This creature lived between two worlds, the old and the new. It was still comfortable among the branches, but was beginning to explore the open plains below. It was as if evolution couldn't decide whether to stay in the trees or step into the future. These early ancestors were constantly adapting to survive in an environment that was rapidly changing. The forests were shrinking, rainfall was becoming scarce, and grasslands were spreading. The animals that once relied on fruit and shelter from trees were forced to wander longer distances for food and safety. This pressure to move, to adapt, and to think would become the driving force of humanity's rise. Fossils tell us that Orrerin's femur, the thigh bone, was shaped in a way that supported upright walking. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Every step forward made life just a little bit easier. Walking on 2 legs freed the hands completely. Hands that could now carry food, cradle infants, and someday wield tools. This simple shift would alter the destiny of an entire species. Over the next million years, the Earth's climate continued to test its creatures. Vast droughts followed by heavy rains transformed the African landscape again and again. And in this endless cycle of destruction and renewal, a new form of early human emerged. Ardipithecus ramidus, living around 4.4 million years ago. Ardipithecus, or Ardi, as scientists affectionately call her, was discovered in the Afar region of Ethiopia. She was unlike any creature seen before. Ardi could walk upright, yet she still had grasping toes for climbing trees. Her world was one of danger and transformation, rivers that flooded, predators that hunted in packs, and forests that seemed to vanish overnight. Yet she survived. Her kind learned to adapt to both the trees and the plains, becoming true masters of balance. The discovery of Artie's skeleton gave scientists one of the clearest windows into what our ancestors looked like before the age of the famous Australopithecus. Her bones showed that walking upright was not something sudden or miraculous. It was gradual, an unbroken chain of adaptation and survival. Humanity's rise was not one great leap. It was millions of small steps. While Artie and her kind thrived in the shifting African landscape, their world was also home to powerful predators. Ancient big cats, giant hyenas, and crocodiles larger than cars. The early ancestors had no weapons, no shelters, no language. Their only defense was awareness. They learned to watch, to listen, and to communicate through simple gestures and sounds. These were not yet humans, but the seeds of intelligence were beginning to grow. As time moved forward, around 4 million years ago, another remarkable species appeared, Australopithecus anamensis. With longer legs and more human-like joints, they walked more confidently on 2 feet. They lived in small groups, perhaps families, moving through the savannas of East Africa. Their diet expanded: fruits, roots, seeds, and maybe even small insects or animals. Every new source of food meant a new opportunity for survival. The Earth, meanwhile, was preparing its next great transformation. Massive tectonic shifts continued to reshape the African continent, creating mountains, valleys, and deep lakes. The Rift Valley itself became a living laboratory of evolution. Each isolated region produced its own variation of early humans, different shapes, sizes, and abilities, all competing to survive in their own unique environments. By 3.5 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis, the most famous of all early ancestors, had arrived. Her fossil, discovered in Ethiopia, was given the name Lucy. Lucy's skeleton revealed a body built for walking long distances. She stood upright, had strong legs, and could use her hands freely. She wasn't human yet, but her movements, her behavior, and her instincts were leading directly toward what we would become. Lucy's world was dangerous and unpredictable. Her kind likely lived in groups for protection, cooperating to find food and to warn each other of threats. Social life, the beginnings of communication and empathy, may have started here. The bonds within these small groups became their greatest weapon. Alone, they were weak. Together, they were unstoppable. Every generation that followed carried forward new lessons: how to survive droughts, how to find shade, how to share food, and perhaps, in the simplest gestures, how to trust one another. What began as instinct was slowly becoming something more, the earliest form of culture. These ancient ancestors didn't know they were paving the way for humankind. They didn't know that millions of years later, their descendants would stand on the moon, build cities, and record history. All they knew was the struggle to see another sunrise. From Sahelanthropus to Ardipithecus, from the trees to the plains, evolution's hand never rested. It shaped bones, brains, and behavior, molding creatures into survivors. Each species carried a piece of the puzzle, a link in the chain that would stretch unbroken to modern humans. And through all those years of change, one thing remained constant: the drive to adapt. No matter how harsh the world became, something inside these early beings refused to surrender. That spark, that will to survive against all odds, is the same fire that still burns in humanity today. The story of our origins is not one of perfection. It is one of persistence. 7 million years ago, the first ancestor took a step into the unknown, and for millions of years after, their children never stopped walking. The age of Lucy and the dawn of intelligence. By the time Australopithecus afarensis roamed the Earth, humanity's ancestors had already endured millions of years of struggle and adaptation. Around 3.5 million years ago, the African continent was alive with new possibilities, a place where survival demanded both strength and intelligence. The early ancestors had learned to walk the land with purpose, their eyes scanning the horizon not just for danger, but for opportunity. Lucy, the most famous of them all, represents this turning point. Discovered in 1974 in Ethiopia's Hadar region, her bones told a story older than imagination. She stood about 3.5 feet tall, with long arms for climbing and strong legs for walking. But beyond her bones was something even more remarkable, evidence of a creature beginning to think. Lucy and her kind, Australopithecus afarensis, were not just reacting to their environment, they were adapting in intelligent ways. They used their surroundings to their advantage. They followed animal herds to find water. They learned the timing of fruiting trees and the migration of predators. They lived in social groups that provided protection and shared knowledge. These weren't instincts anymore. These were the first sparks of awareness, the earliest signs of what would become human intelligence. The African savannas were both cruel and generous. Food was scarce, yet the landscape offered opportunities for those clever enough to take them. Some early ancestors began using natural objects, sticks, stones, and bones, not as weapons yet, but as tools for digging or cracking open hard shells. These simple acts were revolutionary. For the first time, a species on Earth was beginning to manipulate its environment rather than be ruled by it. Around 3 million years ago, another crucial figure emerged in humanity's story, Australopithecus africanus. Living in what is now South Africa, this species carried forward the legacy of Lucy's kind. They had slightly larger brains and more rounded skulls. Their faces looked less ape-like, more familiar. They were moving closer, step by step, toward the beings we would one day recognize as human. Fossilized footprints from Letoli, Tanzania, give us a haunting glimpse of this era. Two early ancestors walking side by side, their steps preserved in volcanic ash. One larger, one smaller, perhaps a parent and child. They walked together across an ancient plain, unaware that their footprints would endure for millions of years. Those prints are not just marks in the earth. They are the first evidence of family, of companionship, of connection. Humanity's emotional story, the bond between one being and another, had already begun. As the millennia rolled forward, the environment continued to shape evolution. Volcanic eruptions, droughts, and floods forced species to migrate, mixing different populations across regions. Each new challenge tested their adaptability. Those who could think, plan, and cooperate survived. Those who couldn't disappeared forever. By 2.8 million years ago, a new species rose from this crucible of survival, Homo habilis, literally meaning handyman. The arrival of Homo habilis was a milestone unlike any before it. This was the dawn of the human genus, the true beginning of what it meant to be human. With hands capable of crafting and brains growing larger than ever before, they were no longer just part of nature, they were beginning to master it. Evidence from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania shows that Homo habilis created some of the first tools in history. Sharp stone flakes used for cutting meat and scraping hides. It was the birth of technology, the moment our ancestors began to shape the world according to their needs. These tools meant access to new food sources, marrow from bones, meat from carcasses, fueling their growing brains with vital nutrients. Evolution had found its rhythm. Intelligence fed survival, and survival fed intelligence. Life, however, remained harsh. Predators still prowled the plains. The nights were cold and shelter was scarce. But Homo habilis had something that no creature on Earth had before: curiosity. They learned by watching, experimenting, and remembering. Each generation built upon the knowledge of the last. Slowly, imperceptibly, knowledge was becoming culture. They may have gathered around riverbeds, communicating through gestures and sounds. They may have shared food, cared for the injured, and mourned the dead. These were not yet humans in the modern sense, but their behavior was starting to reflect empathy and emotion, the first light of humanity's inner world. By this stage, the line between animal and human was fading. Evolution was no longer just sculpting bones and muscles, it was shaping minds. Every discovery, every adaptation brought our ancestors closer to something extraordinary: consciousness. But nature was not done testing them. Around 2.5 million years ago, the climate of Africa changed once again. Grasslands expanded even further, forests vanished, and with them, many species disappeared. But Homo habilis survived, not because they were the strongest, but because they could think differently. They could plan ahead, anticipate danger, and solve problems. This was humanity's true superpower, not strength, but imagination. Over the next several 100,000 years, new species evolved from this line: Homo erectus, Homo rudolfensis, and others. They stood taller, walked further, and began to explore lands beyond their birthplaces. But all of it, every tool, every migration, every leap of intelligence, traced back to those early ancestors like Lucy, who dared to step into a new world. The transformation from ape to human was no miracle. It was a slow, relentless journey carved by time. Each species lived, adapted, and vanished. But their legacy endured within the DNA of those who came next. Humanity was being built piece by piece through endless cycles of trial and triumph. The age of Australopithecus may have ended, but it left behind the greatest gift of all: the mind that could imagine the future. What began as survival had turned into awareness. The creatures of the past were now becoming creators of tomorrow. The story was far from over. The world was changing faster than ever, and soon our ancestors would face challenges that would push them to their limits and beyond. Fire, migration, and discovery lay ahead. But the foundation was set. The spark of thought had been lit, and it all began 7 million years ago. The fire makers. By around 2 million years ago, the Earth had entered one of its most dramatic eras. The landscape of Africa was transforming. Lush forests had given way to vast open grasslands. The air was cooler, the seasons harsher, and survival had become a test of endurance. Many ancient species had vanished, but one stood firm against nature's fury: Homo erectus, the upright human. This was the first of our ancestors who looked and moved almost entirely like us. Homo erectus stood tall, walked long distances, and had a larger brain than any species before it. Their discovery across Africa and beyond, in places like Java, China, and the Caucasus, tells us something revolutionary. Humanity had begun to explore the world. No longer confined to one region, Homo erectus became the first true wanderer, the pioneer of migration. They journeyed far beyond Africa's borders, adapting to new lands, new climates, and new challenges. And as they spread across continents, they carried with them the most powerful discovery in human history: fire. The mastery of fire was not instant. It began with curiosity. Perhaps lightning struck a dry tree, setting it ablaze. Early humans must have approached cautiously, fascinated and terrified by the glowing light. But somewhere along the line, they learned to control it, to keep the flames alive, to nurture them. That moment changed everything. Fire was warmth during freezing nights, protection from predators, and a tool to cook food, making it softer, safer, and more nutritious. It transformed their diet and supercharged their evolution. Cooked food required less chewing and digestion, allowing more energy to fuel brain growth. With every flame that burned, humanity's mind grew brighter. Fire also gave something deeper: time. No longer ruled entirely by the sun, Homo erectus could now gather around flickering light after dark. Some scientists believe that around those fires, language began to evolve. Simple sounds turned into patterns, gestures became words. The ability to share stories, to pass on knowledge, and to imagine together. This was the beginning of culture. Evidence of Homo erectus hearths, ancient fire pits, has been found in caves across Africa, Europe, and Asia. In those ashes lie traces of charred bones, burned stones, and the earliest signs of community. Fire didn't just change the body, it changed the soul. It brought people together. It created the first circles of human connection. But with discovery came new challenges. Life on the move meant facing unfamiliar predators, unpredictable weather, and endless uncertainty. Homo erectus had to adapt again and again. They learned to make more advanced stone tools, known as the Acheulean hand axes, perfectly shaped teardrop tools that could cut, chop, and carve with precision. These tools were not random. They were planned, symmetrical, and crafted with skill. It was evidence of a growing intelligence, one that could imagine a result before it existed. Every tool was a thought made visible, every flame a symbol of progress, every step across the land a sign of ambition. And slowly, through countless generations, Homo erectus transformed from mere survivors into innovators. They learned to hunt in groups, to communicate through more complex sounds, and to care for their young and elders. Archaeological evidence suggests that injured individuals were often tended to, a sign of empathy, compassion, and social structure. Humanity was learning not just to survive, but to live together. Across thousands of years, Homo erectus spread further into the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Their adaptability was unmatched. They built temporary shelters, sought out caves, and used natural materials to protect themselves. Their footprints appear in the deserts of Arabia, the jungles of Indonesia, and the icy plains of Eurasia. They had become explorers in the truest sense, conquerors, not of others, but of fear and distance. And through this long journey, their greatest transformation was happening silently, inside the brain. The average brain size of Homo erectus grew to nearly 1,000 cubic centimeters, almost double that of Homo habilis. This growth wasn't just physical, it represented imagination, problem-solving, and memory. These were the roots of modern human thought. Around 1.5 million years ago, their numbers increased. Populations thrived across continents. They mastered their environments, hunting large animals, gathering plants, and developing strategies for survival. Yet nature's test never ended. Climate shifts once again brought droughts and cold ages, forcing migrations, isolating groups, and driving evolution in new directions. Some populations of Homo erectus evolved differently depending on their environments. Those who stayed in Africa would eventually give rise to the next great leap in our lineage, Homo heidelbergensis, a species smarter, stronger, and more aware than ever before. The bridge between ancient and modern humans was forming. But before that, Homo erectus left an unshakable legacy. For nearly 2 million years they thrived, longer than any species of human before or after. They were the masters of endurance, the first to look beyond the horizon and wonder what lay ahead. Every fire they lit was a symbol of hope in the darkness, a spark of the consciousness that defines humanity. From their hands came tools, from their curiosity came fire, and from their courage came exploration. They did not know it then, but they were preparing the stage for everything that would follow: art, civilization, and the modern mind. The journey of humanity was accelerating. The flames that Homo erectus carried across the world would ignite the next great chapter. The rise of Homo heidelbergensis, the hunters, the thinkers, and the ancestors who would soon give birth to Homo sapiens. The world was changing again, and in those ancient winds, the future of humanity was beginning to whisper its name: the dawn of intelligence. As the millennia rolled forward, around 700,000 years ago, a new kind of human emerged from the depths of Africa and Europe: Homo heidelbergensis. They were taller, stronger, and smarter than their predecessors. Their eyes looked out at a world of ice and fire, forests and plains, and they began to understand it in ways no species had before. For the first time, humans were not just reacting to the world, they were shaping it. Homo heidelbergensis hunted in organized groups, crafting wooden spears sharp enough to pierce the hide of elephants and rhinoceroses. Their stone tools were refined, their hunting strategies precise. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of large-scale hunts, evidence that these early humans worked together, planned, and shared the rewards. Cooperation had evolved from instinct to strategy. But beyond hunting and survival, something deeper was stirring. They began to form social bonds that went beyond necessity. The dead were no longer left behind. They were sometimes buried, suggesting the birth of emotion, of memory, and of something profoundly human: respect for life. In their shelters and caves, traces of fire pits and tools tell a silent story: the growth of mind and imagination. The nights were filled with flickering flames and perhaps, for the first time, spoken words. Simple languages may have taken form, born from gestures and sounds, weaving connection into every moment of existence. It was around this era that our ancestors began to venture into the unknown, braving cold climates and crossing territories that had never felt human footsteps. Ice Age winds howled across the continents, but humanity refused to stop. From Africa to Europe, from the Levant to Asia, these early humans adapted like no creature ever had. And in this relentless adaptation, evolution began to divide them. Those who remained in Africa would eventually evolve into the direct ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens. Those who ventured into colder, harsher regions of Europe would slowly transform into another form of humanity, the Neanderthals. Both species shared the same ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, and both carried within them the same spark of intelligence and resilience. Yet their journeys would unfold differently. In Africa, the warmer climate favored innovation and creativity. Populations experimented with tools made of bone and stone, refining techniques and learning to think abstractly. They developed throwing weapons, carved objects, and began to use color, possibly the earliest forms of art and symbolism. These were the beginnings of thought beyond survival, thought about meaning. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Neanderthals adapted to a frozen world. Stockier and stronger, they learned to live in caves, to hunt massive Ice Age beasts, and to endure endless winters. Though often depicted as primitive, the Neanderthals were remarkably intelligent. They crafted fine tools, made jewelry, and even cared for their sick and elderly. They were not savages, they were thinkers, builders, and dreamers of a different kind. Back in Africa, the foundations of our story were being laid. Between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens appeared. Their skulls were rounder, their faces smaller, and their brains more complex than any before. With them began a revolution of the mind, the cognitive leap. This was the birth of imagination. They looked at the stars and wondered what they were. They painted caves with the images of animals they hunted. They began to carve symbols that meant something, something beyond the physical world. For the first time, humanity was not just living in the present. They were thinking about the past and dreaming about the future. Fire became more than warmth. It was ritual. Tools became more than necessity. They were expressions of creativity. And words, real, complex language, became the foundation of human connection. This was the true beginning of humanity as we know it. Across thousands of years, early Homo sapiens spread outward into Arabia, Asia, and eventually Europe. They met their distant cousins, the Neanderthals, and for a time, both species shared the earth. Evidence suggests they even interbred, leaving traces of Neanderthal DNA in us today, a genetic echo of an ancient encounter. But there was something unique about Homo sapiens, a mental spark that no other species quite matched. Their capacity for innovation, adaptation, and abstract thought gave them an advantage that would change the fate of the planet. They began to create tools that no one had ever imagined before: needles to sew clothes, fish hooks, bows, and arrows. They painted on cave walls in France and Spain, using colors made from crushed minerals, telling stories that would survive tens of thousands of years. They crafted figurines and carved shapes that represented ideas, symbols of belief, fertility, and life. Humanity was no longer bound by instinct. They were driven by imagination. By around 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were standing at the edge of a world waiting to be explored. They had the knowledge, the skill, and the desire to move, to seek what lay beyond the horizon. And so, they began the greatest migration in history. From Africa, groups of humans started moving into the Middle East, then Asia, and finally Europe. Some crossed narrow seas, reaching distant islands. Others followed herds and rivers, traveling vast distances. Everywhere they went, they adapted, learned, and transformed. And with each step, they carried the story of millions of years of struggle, discovery, and evolution. The journey that began 7 million years ago with ape-like ancestors now stood on the brink of civilization. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning, the moment before humans would rise to dominate the world, build societies, and shape destiny itself. The earth was changing again, and humanity, now fully awake, was ready to claim its place upon it. The rise of modern humanity. By 70,000 years ago, the world had changed beyond recognition. The planet was colder, the ice age tightening its grip on the continents. Vast glaciers blanketed the north, while deserts expanded across Africa and Asia. Yet amidst this harshness, one species began to rise above all others: Homo sapiens, the species that would define the future. They were dreamers, inventors, and survivors. They could adapt to any environment: scorching deserts, frozen tundras, humid forests. And they carried with them something no other species had mastered: the power of imagination. For the first time, humans began to think symbolically. They painted vivid scenes of bison and deer on cave walls, using natural pigments mixed with animal fat. These weren't mere decorations, they were stories, prayers, or memories preserved in color. On the walls of Chauvet Cave in France and the ancient shelters of Blombos Cave in South Africa, early humans left behind art that spoke of identity, belief, and the dawn of culture. They also began to bury their dead with care, sometimes adorned with beads or ochre. This was no longer survival alone. It was the beginning of faith, the belief that there was something beyond death, something unseen but deeply felt. It marked the emergence of spirituality and philosophy, the birth of meaning in the human heart. Across Africa, small tribes became tight-knit communities. They hunted, gathered, and thrived, guided by language more advanced than ever before. Words connected, thought to action, stories to memory, and people to purpose. Communication allowed humans to plan, to teach, to dream together. It gave rise to collective wisdom, the foundation of civilization. Around 60,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began to move again, leaving the cradle of Africa to explore the wider world. They crossed land bridges that no longer exist, followed coastlines and sailed across narrow seas. Within a few thousand years, humans had reached Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and even the distant shores of Australia. Their journey was not easy. Harsh climates, predators, and rival species stood in their way. But wherever they went, they adapted, crafting new tools, building shelters, and discovering new foods. This ability to innovate in every situation was what set Homo sapiens apart. They didn't just survive change, they used it. Then, around 45,000 years ago, they entered Europe and came face to face with the Neanderthals, their powerful cousins who had ruled the cold north for hundreds of thousands of years. The meeting of these two species was a turning point in history. At first, they may have competed for territory, for resources, for survival. But evidence also shows that they shared something more profound: connection. They interbred, exchanged tools, and perhaps even shared ideas. The Neanderthals taught survival in the cold. Homo sapiens brought art, creativity, and symbolic thought. For a brief moment in time, two intelligent worlds coexisted. Yet, as millennia passed, the Neanderthals faded. Climate change, competition, and isolation pushed them toward extinction. By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens stood alone, the last surviving branch of a family that had begun over 7 million years earlier. Now, they began to reshape the earth itself. They crafted new hunting tools, bows, arrows, and spear throwers, and developed clothing from animal hides sewn with bone needles. They used fire not only for warmth, but to forge stronger tools and to cook with precision. Settlements grew larger, and tribes began to trade goods, knowledge, and culture. Humanity had entered a new age, the age of expansion and innovation. But something even greater was taking place within the human mind. Around 30,000 years ago, humans began to create not just for survival, but for beauty. Ivory carvings, flutes made of bone, and figurines of gods and mothers appeared across Europe and Asia. The famous Venus figurines symbolize fertility and life, proof that humans were thinking abstractly, dreaming, and expressing emotion through creation. Language evolved into complex speech. Myths and stories were told by the fireside, tales of creation, of animals, of ancestors. These stories shaped identity, passed down through generations, connecting people to their origins. Humanity was learning not only to survive time, but to preserve it through memory. By 20,000 years ago, the world was still locked in ice, yet humans thrived everywhere, from Africa to Europe, from the frozen plains of Siberia to the warm jungles of Southeast Asia. They adapted their homes, their clothes, and their diets to each environment. They were no longer just part of nature, they were beginning to master it. Then came one of the greatest revolutions in all of history: the agricultural revolution. Around 12,000 years ago, after countless generations of hunting and gathering, humans began to settle. They learned to plant seeds, to grow crops, and to domesticate animals. Villages emerged near rivers and fertile lands, and for the first time people stayed in one place. This was the birth of civilization. With farming came food surpluses, and with surpluses came trade, hierarchy, and invention. Humans built homes, crafted pottery, and invented writing to record their stories. The great journey that began 7 million years ago, from ape-like ancestors in the forests of Africa, had finally led to the creation of society. The spark that once flickered in the eyes of Australopithecus had become a blaze of intelligence that lit the entire world. And yet our story is not one of perfection. It is one of survival, evolution, and adaptation, of triumph and tragedy, discovery and loss. Every fossil, every ancient tool, every cave painting is a reminder of who we once were and how far we've come. The untold origins of humanity are not just written in stone. They live within us, in our blood, our bones, our curiosity, and our dreams. From the shadows of prehistory to the rise of civilization, one truth endures. We are not separate from the past. We are the past, evolved, enduring, and ever searching. The journey that began 7 million years ago never truly ended. It continues. Every time we look to the stars and wonder where we came from and where we will go next.